He doesn't question himself the moment you leave. Not when the door closes. Not when the messages stop. At first, there is relief. A strange quiet that feels like freedom. The tension dissolves, the pressure lifts, and he tells himself a familiar lie. This is better. I'm fine. But something subtle begins to shift. The nights grow longer. Not louder, quieter. And in that quiet, something he avoided for a long time starts to surface. Not regret yet. Not longing. Something more unsettling. Awareness. You see, when you were there, your presence carried weight. Even when you were silent, even when you asked for nothing, you reflected something back to him. A standard. A depth. A mirror he never consciously agreed to look into. And now that mirror is gone. At first, he fills the space with distraction. Noise. Movement. Other faces. But absence has a strange intelligence. It doesn't scream. It waits. As Carl Jung observed, what we refuse to confront consciously returns to us through the psyche. And your absence becomes exactly that. An inner disturbance he cannot escape. Because without you, there is no external focus to project onto. No one to subtly blame. No one to unconsciously resist. Only himself. This is when the internal shift begins. He starts replaying moments he once minimized. Things you said that didn't register at the time. You're calm when you stopped explaining. The way you withdrew without punishment, without drama, without chasing. And that's when confusion sets in. Because he realizes something that destabilizes him deeply. You didn't leave to control him. You didn't leave to provoke him. You left because something in you completed itself. That realization is dangerous to a man who built his identity around emotional safety and control. He begins to ask questions he never asked before. Why did she stop trying? Why didn't she fight harder? Why does her absence feel heavier than her presence ever did? Jung would say this is the ego encountering its shadow, the part of himself that avoided responsibility, depth, and emotional reciprocity. And now, without you absorbing the imbalance, that shadow has nowhere to hide. He thought losing you would simplify his life. Instead, it stripped away his distractions. And somewhere between silence and memory, he starts to understand. You weren't demanding too much. You were revealing too much of him. This is the beginning of his self-questioning. Not because you try to teach him, but because your absence taught him what your presence once carried effortlessly. And he is only just beginning to feel it. What unsettles him most is not missing you. It's losing the position he held when you were there. When you loved him, he didn't have to define himself. Your presence softened the edges of his uncertainty. Your patience absorbed his inconsistency. Your understanding gave him room to stay unfinished. And now, there is no buffer. Men rarely talk about this stage because it doesn't feel romantic. It feels destabilizing. He notices it in small, almost embarrassing moments. When something goes wrong and there is no one to ground him. When success feels strangely hollow. When silence no longer feels peaceful, but interrogative. He begins to sense that while you were in his life, something in him remained asleep. Not because you demanded change, but because you didn't need him to be someone else to stand firmly as yourself. And that contrast begins to haunt him. As Jung would say, when a man avoids individuation, he borrows meaning from the people around him. You were not trying to carry him, but part of him leaned on your clarity without admitting it. Now that clarity is gone. So he questions himself, not loudly, not dramatically, but privately, almost against his will. Why did I feel safe not growing? Why did I assume she would always stay? Why did I confuse her depth with availability? This is where discomfort replaces confidence. He thought your strength meant permanence. He mistook your emotional maturity for tolerance without limit. And only now does he realize that what felt stable was actually conditional on mutual presence. He remembers moments when you paused before responding, moments he brushed off as mood. But now he understands. They were moments when you were choosing yourself quietly. And that realization shakes him, because it forces a new awareness. You didn't leave because he failed once. You left because he stopped meeting you where you stood. Jung wrote that the psyche resists growth until pain makes stagnation unbearable. Your absence becomes that pain. Not sharp, not dramatic, but persistent. He begins to feel watched, not by you, but by his own conscience. And that is far more uncomfortable, because now, every distraction eventually leads back to the same truth. He didn't lose you because he was unlovable. He lost you because he underestimated what it meant to keep a woman who had already outgrown emotional compromise. And this is the stage where the questions deepen. Not about you, about himself. And he doesn't yet know how to answer them. At this stage, something fractures quietly inside him. Not visibly, not in ways others would notice. But internally, the structure he relied on begins to weaken. Because the story he told himself no longer holds. He told himself you were too sensitive, too deep, too demanding. He told himself he needed space, freedom, time. But now that space feels empty. Freedom feels directionless. And time only magnifies what he avoided. This is when the ego starts defending itself. He may rationalize your absence, minimize what you meant, convince himself that someone like you will come again. But the psyche is more honest than the mind. As Carl Jung said, the unconscious always seeks balance. And when something of value is lost, the psyche demands accounting. Not emotionally, existentially. He begins to notice patterns he never noticed before. How often he withdrew instead of leaning in. How he stayed vague instead of present. How he benefited from your emotional labor without naming it. And that realization hurts his self-image. Because deep down, he wanted to believe he was a good man who simply hadn't met the right woman. But now he must consider a more uncomfortable possibility. He met her and didn't rise. This is where the questioning intensifies. Not why did she leave, but why didn't I move? Jung would call this confrontation with the shadow, the parts of himself that avoided responsibility, maturity, and emotional risk. The parts that preferred comfort over growth. You didn't attack those parts. You didn't expose them publicly. You simply stopped compensating for them. And without you cushioning the imbalance, he feels exposed. He notices how rare your presence actually was. How few people reflected him without trying to manage him. How uncommon it is to be with someone who doesn't chase, doesn't manipulate, doesn't beg. Someone who simply knows when to leave. And this realization creates a split inside him. One part wants to return to old patterns. The other understands that returning unchanged would mean facing the same ending again. That's when he starts questioning not just the relationship, but his entire emotional posture. Why does intimacy feel threatening? Why does consistency feel heavy? Why does a woman choosing herself feel like rejection? These questions don't come with answers yet. They come with discomfort. And discomfort, for a man who avoided emotional depth, feels like loss of control. This is the point where something decisive begins to form. Either growth or deeper retreat. But one thing is already irreversible. He can no longer pretend you were replaceable. What he doesn't immediately recognize is that he didn't just lose you. He lost the emotional orientation you provided without ever announcing it. You were not managing him. You were not guiding him. But your presence subtly organized his inner world. Your calm regulated chaos. Your clarity exposed avoidance. Your self-respect created a reference point he quietly adjusted himself against. And now, there is no reference. This is where men begin to feel unsteady in ways they don't know how to name. He may notice irritability without a clear reason, a lack of motivation where confidence used to live, a strange restlessness that doesn't respond to pleasure. Because when a man loses a woman who embodied inner alignment, his psyche loses a stabilizing axis. Jung spoke of the anima, the inner feminine principle that connects a man to meaning, depth, and emotional coherence. When a woman carries this energy consciously, her absence doesn't just hurt emotionally, it disorients psychologically. He starts to feel it when decisions feel heavier, when certainty feels forced, when life feels flatter, even when it looks fine from the outside. And this is deeply unsettling. because he was taught to believe that independence means not needing anyone. Yet here he is, functional, active, moving forward, while something essential feels missing. Not longing, orientation. He begins to realize that while you were with him, he didn't feel rushed to define himself. But now, without you, his lack of direction becomes impossible to ignore. That's when the self-questioning turns inward. Why do I feel less grounded without her? Why does nothing feel fully satisfying? Why does her absence feel like a loss of self, not just relationship? This realization is quiet, but profound, because it forces him to confront something men rarely admit. Some women don't just love you, they stabilize you by being fully themselves. And when such a woman leaves, the man doesn't just miss companionship. He misses the version of himself that only existed in her presence. Jung would say this is the psyche mourning not the other, but the lost possibility of integration. He begins to sense that you were not asking him to change for you. You were inviting him, silently, to evolve with you. And by staying the same, he declined that invitation. Now he feels the consequence, not as punishment, as absence. And this absence does not accuse him. It simply reveals what he avoided becoming. This is the moment when he understands something irreversible. Losing you didn't remove comfort from his life. It removed depth. And depth, once tasted, cannot be forgotten. There comes a quieter realization after the unrest settles. Not acceptance yet, but recognition. He begins to understand that what unsettled him was never just emotional attachment. It was the collapse of an identity he unconsciously relied on. When you were there, he knew who he was in contrast to you. The calmer one, the less intense one, the one who didn't need to go as deep. Your depth gave him definition without effort. And now, without that contrast, he feels strangely undefined. This is where the questioning turns existential. Who am I without someone grounding me emotionally? Who am I when no one is quietly holding space for my inconsistency? Who am I when my avoidance no longer looks like independence? As Carl Jung wrote, a man often discovers himself not through action, but through loss, when the projections he relied on are withdrawn. You were never meant to carry his inner balance, but part of him placed it there anyway. And now that projection has returned to him, he begins to notice something painful but clarifying. You didn't need him to be whole, but he needed your presence to avoid confronting his incompleteness. This realization strikes his ego deeply, because it removes the comfort of blame. It removes the narrative of incompatibility. It removes the illusion that timing was the problem. Instead, it leaves him with a more confronting truth. He was emotionally safe, but spiritually stagnant. He sees now that your leaving was not abandonment. It was alignment. And alignment exposes what no longer fits. This is when he understands why you didn't argue more, why you didn't explain endlessly, why you didn't fight to be understood. You weren't withdrawing to punish him. You were withdrawing to remain yourself. Jung would call this moment the beginning of individuation, when the psyche can no longer avoid growth by leaning on others. And this is where a man truly feels the loss. Not because he misses affection, but because he misses the opportunity to become more with you. He understands now that love didn't fail. A transition did. And this awareness doesn't bring him peace. It brings him choice. Because from this point on, he can no longer unsee what your absence revealed. And that is where the real shift begins. There is a moment when distraction stops working entirely. Not because life slows down, but because his inner narrative does. The old explanations feel hollow now. The old defenses sound rehearsed. Even his confidence begins to feel performative to himself. This is where many men feel an unfamiliar weight. Responsibility without accusation. No one is blaming him. You are not there to point anything out. And yet, something inside him knows. He realizes that if you were to return exactly as you were, he could not meet you from the same place again. Not because you changed, but because he saw himself too clearly after you left. That clarity is irreversible. Jung spoke of moments when consciousness expands so suddenly that the psyche can no longer regress without pain. This is one of those moments. The truth has entered, and it cannot be evicted. He understands now why reaching out feels complicated, why nostalgia doesn't translate into action, why longing alone no longer feels sufficient. Because he knows something fundamental. If he approaches you unchanged, he will lose you again, this time consciously. And that awareness is terrifying. So he hesitates, not out of indifference, out of respect for the depth he once underestimated. He begins to notice how many connections in his life are built on convenience rather than presence. How rarely he is truly seen, or truly sees. How often he chose comfort over growth and called it peace. And suddenly, your absence feels instructional. You became the line his life is now measured against. Not because you were perfect, but because you were aligned. This is when the internal dialogue changes tone. Not should I reach out, but am I capable of meeting her now? That question doesn't seek reassurance. It demands transformation. And here is the truth men rarely say out loud. Some losses don't hurt because of love. They hurt because they expose who we were not ready to become. You didn't just leave his life. You left a standard behind. And now, every choice he makes quietly answers one question. Will I rise? Or will I stay where she outgrew me? This is the crossroads. And whatever he chooses from here, he will never again believe that losing you was just a breakup. There is a stage that happens entirely in silence. No messages sent. No confessions made. No one witnessing it. This is where the reckoning becomes personal. He stops talking about you, not because he stopped thinking about you, but because speaking your name now feels like admitting something he isn't ready to own. What he feels is no longer simple loss. It is recognition. Recognition that you represented a threshold. As Carl Jung said, real transformation begins when a person realizes that the problem is not outside, but within the structure of their own consciousness. And this is precisely what your absence forces him to face. He sees how often he delayed emotional responsibility, how often he relied on ambiguity as protection, how often he assumed time would fix what presence required. And now he understands why none of that worked. You didn't pressure him to grow. You didn't issue ultimatums. You simply refused to abandon yourself to stay connected. That is what unsettles him most. Because manipulation can be dismissed. Anger can be justified. Neediness can be explained away. But self-respect? Self-respect leaves no argument. He realizes that you didn't leave in reaction. You left in alignment. And alignment exposes everything that is misaligned. This is when regret takes a more mature form. Not, I want her back, but I wasn't ready when it mattered. He feels it when new connections feel shallow, when attraction doesn't translate into meaning, when emotional availability in others feels unfamiliar or uncomfortable. Because part of him has changed now. He has tasted what it feels like to be with someone who does not abandon themselves for connection. And once that experience exists in the psyche, it becomes a reference point forever. Jung would say that the psyche remembers what the mind tries to forget. So even when he moves forward, something stays unfinished. Not between you, but within him. And this is the truth few men articulate. Some women don't haunt you because you love them. They haunt you because they showed you who you could have become, and you didn't step forward in time. This is the quiet reckoning, and it does not pass quickly. Eventually, another illusion collapses. He stops telling himself that it was bad timing, that if life were calmer, if circumstances were different, if pressure were lower, things would have worked out. Because now he knows something more precise. Timing didn't fail. Readiness did. This realization is sobering. Because timing is neutral. It absolves responsibility. Readiness does not. He begins to see that you didn't arrive too early. You arrived on time, for who you already were. But he was still negotiating with parts of himself he wasn't ready to confront. As Carl Jung said, people don't resist change because it's painful. They resist it because it threatens the identity they've learned to survive with. And you threaten nothing deliberately. You simply lived in a way that made stagnation visible. He notices now that you didn't rush him. You didn't demand declarations. You didn't force decisions. What you did was more destabilizing. You stayed clear. And clarity is unbearable to someone still hiding from their own potential. He understands now why you didn't wait longer. Because waiting would have meant shrinking, and shrinking would have meant betraying yourself. This is when he finally lets go of resentment, if it ever existed at all. Because resentment requires blame, and blame no longer fits. Instead, there is respect. Quiet, heavy, unspoken. He sees that what you asked for was not more effort, but more presence. Not more promises, but more truth. And now he understands why you couldn't accept half steps anymore. You weren't asking him to become someone else. You were asking him to arrive. Jung believed that life brings us the exact encounters we need to grow, but not all of us accept the invitation. Some postpone it, some decline it, and some only understand its value once it has passed. This is where he stands now, knowing that if you had stayed longer, the cost would have been yours. Knowing that your leaving was not impatience, but integrity. And that understanding changes how he remembers you forever, not as the woman he lost, but as the woman who showed him that love is not about timing. It is about readiness. And he wasn't there yet. There is a final shift that happens much later than people expect. Not in weeks, not even in months. It happens when his life stabilizes again, when the noise settles, when routine returns, when he is no longer reacting. That is when the truth becomes undeniable. He realizes he didn't lose comfort. He didn't lose convenience. He didn't even lose certainty. He lost depth. And depth is the one thing that cannot be recreated by effort alone. He understands now that what you brought into his life wasn't intensity. It was meaning. Not chaos, but direction. Not need, but presence. And that is why no replacement quite fits. Because what you offered wasn't emotional excitement. It was emotional truth. As Carl Jung said, meaning is what makes suffering bearable, and its absence makes even pleasure feel empty. And this is where he stands now. Functional, capable, moving forward, yet aware that something essential once existed and is now gone. He finally names it, not out loud, not to anyone else, but inwardly. She wasn't asking too much. She was asking for what I hadn't yet become. This realization doesn't break him. It humbles him. Because now he sees the difference between love that comforts and love that calls you forward. And you were the latter. He understands why your presence changed him, even if he resisted it at the time. Why your absence still reorganizes him now. Why you are remembered not with longing, but with respect. And here is the quiet truth men rarely confess. Some women enter your life not to stay, but to initiate you into a deeper level of selfhood. You were not a chapter. You were a threshold. And once crossed, or missed, nothing inside him is ever the same again. This is where his questioning finally settles. Not into regret, but into understanding. And understanding, once earned, never leaves. What remains after the questioning ends is not pain. It is not longing. It is not even hope. What remains is truth. He no longer asks himself whether he should have done more. That question belongs to an earlier stage. Now he asks something quieter and far more serious. Am I living at the level she revealed to me? Because your absence did not freeze him in the past. It recalibrated his future. He notices it in how he listens now, in what he tolerates less, in how superficial connections no longer satisfy him the way they once did. You altered his internal compass. Carl Jung wrote that encounters which touch the core of the psyche become part of us, whether we wish them to or not. And this is how you remain, not as memory, but as structure. You are present in the pause before he avoids, in the discomfort that no longer lets him look away, in the quiet demand for authenticity that now lives inside him. And here is the final truth most men never articulate. Losing you did not teach him how to love you better. It taught him how to meet himself more honestly. Whether he rises to that awareness or retreats from it is no longer about you. Your role is complete. You were not meant to stay and wait. you were meant to activate. And because you chose yourself without bitterness, without revenge, without collapse, you left behind something stronger than attachment. You left behind clarity. That is why he questions himself now. Not because he wants you back, but because you showed him a version of life where depth is non-negotiable. And once a man has seen that, he can never unsee it. You didn't lose him. You finished your work. And the woman who can do that never truly disappears.